Tennessee Ministry Network, welcome. I've got a new friend.
Yeah.
From New York.
That's right.
But here now in Tennessee, Pastor John. So excited that you're here.
Yeah. Do you need to move this closer?
Yeah. No, you're fine. It'll pick up good.
Great.
But want to dive in really quick because you've been around for a few years here, but
Sure.
Some people may not know you. Give me like the quick introduction of who you are, what you're doing, and why God is kind of leading you in this new season, working with Tennessee Ministry Network in regards to foster care.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm excited. I love, first off, I love Tennessee. You can see my Vols hat. I actually had to ask when I could become a Vols fan because I didn't want to be the bandwagoner when I first moved here.
Sure.
And then I realized, in college football, everyone in the state of Tennessee isn't a Vols fan. I didn't know that either.
No.
Because college football isn't like a huge thing in New York.
In New York, right.
It's more like pro football because you got three teams, Jets, Bills,
Sure.
Giants.
Sure.
Which I think Buffalo is probably the only good one out of everybody right now.
Right.
But coming here, I loved the culture, and I think I immediately kind of just jumped in and was like, man, I love this place. And the big thing that I saw right out of the gate is just the community aspect of just across the board, whether it's faith-based or not, people are just, how can we help? What can we do? If they really believe in what you're doing, they want to be a part of it. So kind of just backstory, like I've been in ministry for 20 years of my life. I grew up in a really humble home in upstate New York, Cortland, New York, 2-bedroom, 1-bath home. Mom and dad regularly had vulnerable children and youth in our home. Wow. Like it was just the culture. Yeah. And so I grew up seeing many, many kids come in and out through elementary, middle school, high school, even college years. And that really rubbed off on me and my DNA. And so, the young age of 19, I just started serving in any capacity that I could for our church and just working with vulnerable children and families. Yeah. And fast forward to now, I've been doing it for 20 years. Eventually went to Bible college in Hillsong, Australia, which was great at the time. Old school Hillsong, back in the day, you know. So not new Hillsong.
I got you.
It's funny when you tell people that because they're like, I actually talked with somebody recently and, back in the day you could say, oh man, I went to Hillsong and people are like, whoa, that's so cool. Yeah. And nowadays you're like, hey, I went to Hillsong and people are like, ooh.
What's wrong with you?
Yeah, what do you really
that's
believe
terrible.
in?
It's so
No,
bad.
it's so bad. But I will say going there, not to get on this soapbox, but there's a lot of people who love Jesus there. Yeah. And there's so much good that came out of that. And I believe God is so much bigger than all of these type of things and the hype, and he does all this stuff. So.
I was going to say, did you come back with an accent at all?
I did, dude.
When
I pray, so to this day, I pray, and my wife will be like, oh gosh, you went Australian. I'm like, no way. And she's like, yeah, you gotta stop doing that. It's so weird.
I had a friend go and come back, and I was just like, you just seem like so dumb that you would have this accent now. Like
dude, you really did.
Like you were there for 3
I was ashamed of myself.
Well, it's like you were there for 3 months and now you're Australian.
Yeah.
But
I was longer. I was there for over a year, but
it's over a year. Okay.
I think I just have a naturally addictive personality, and I just I love culture, and so whenever I'm in that culture, I'm just all in. I want to learn. I just love that, and so I think just by doing that, I don't know, it just rubbed off on me.
Are you picking up the Tennessee accent at all?
No. Okay. Well, there's some sayings, that I picked up. I did switch from you guys to New York to y'all. Okay. Yeah. And I did it actually on stage, and I caught myself, and everybody was cracking up. They were like, oh my gosh, he's a true.
So when we were missionaries, because we still have family and connections up in New York and Massachusetts and stuff, and I traveled up there to preach and raise funds and stuff. Yeah. I dropped the Southern accent so quick.
Nice.
Like when I hang out with my mom's family in Pittsburgh, like I'll catch myself like doing the Pennsylvania Dutch, everything's a question, accent thing. Yeah, that's funny. And like it's so funny because like I don't hear myself do it.
Right.
But like my wife will be like, who are you?
I know.
Like it's the whole Australian thing for you. It's like, who are
our wives
you?
Always know. They do this like, and they look at you like, what?
Yeah.
Like, what are you
but
doing
it's
right
like,
now?
and it's like the chameleon, like I'm trying to fit in,
That's
know, and connect. And
to the Jew, the Gentile, the Gentile. That's what it is.
I love it.
That's awesome.
Well, so you've been here for 3.5 years now.
Yep.
And you're credentialed with the AG. I want to dive into foster care here in Tennessee. I love that that's kind of been like a natural thing for your background and everything. Sure. But give us some of the needs and why it's needed and why the church needs to be kind of the answer to this problem.
Sure. This space is it's such a nuanced space, man. Like, and the challenge with it is, I think there's just a lot of lack of education. I think when we think of foster care, we kind of tend to think of, okay, like human trafficking, foster care, we kind of segregate these things, the widow, whatever. And maybe we've had a missionary come in at one point and share about different things in our life or whatever our context is. But I think when you really look and you really get into the foster care space of how it affects everything,
right?
You have your teachers, so you have your education, that's part of it. You have your judicial system, that's part of it. So your judges, your police officers, those are affected by it, right? And then you have the state. So there's state workers that are dedicated to the space that are trying to basically solve a problem that was never theirs to begin with.
Right.
And then you have the church. They come in and out of your church. Maybe you know or don't know. And then on top of it all, whether you have, I don't even know what my last one was. I was trying to sound really smart and I don't know.
You're talking about the church.
Yeah, the church was one. And then I don't know what the last one was, but my point is, like, you have so many places that are affected by this. And then what happens is, like, we don't really realize, like, how it affects us as leaders and what we do, whether that's your church, whether that's your business, whether that's you as a teacher, whether that's you as a caseworker, whether that's fill in the blank. Like, it goes into everything. I was just we threw this foster family night out for our organization. So I run an organization as well that I'm a founder of, called the Bridge House. We provide transitional housing for kids that are in DCS custody and also for kids that are aging out of foster care, ages 18 to 20. Yeah. And we also wrap around foster and adoptive families. So we have a foster family night out. We had 50 families show up. They drop their kids off. They go hang out. We even had, we're located in Wilson County. We serve all Middle Tennessee with this nonprofit. But we had a family even come out from Franklin who just needed a break. Yeah. They just needed, I said, where'd you come from? Oh, Franklin. I'm like, you drove an hour and plus to get out here just so you can get a break? She's like, yes. Well, my son comes, and before my son got there was this kid, and he's so upset that his parents are dropping off. He's crying, very upset. I engage with him, talk with him. Him and I turn on the Alabama-Tennessee game. I say, hey, you like football? And we start to have a conversation, and I say, where do you go to school? And he says, I go to this school. We engage back and forth. And I was like, hey, do you know someone named Ben? And he goes, Ben Widrick? And I was like, well, yeah. I was like, well, that's my son. He goes, no way. And I said, well, Ben's going to be here in a minute. So Ben comes in. My son, Ben, had no idea. He sits across this kid every day at the lunch table. They're friends. Yeah. They laugh. Yeah. He had no idea that kiddo was in foster care.
Wow.
And so I told Ben when we left, I said, Ben, it's going to be really important that you make it a point to make sure that you don't disclose that to his friends now, where he can feel safe.
Sure.
And I asked Ben when he went to school that following day, I was like, did he seem a little bit nervous that you knew now that he was in foster care? And Ben said, like, oh, big time. And he said, so I had to go talk with him afterwards to let him know, like, hey, man, I'm not going to say anything. Like, just want to protect you, but I'm here for you. They played the whole time. They hung out. They're 13. But it just shows you, like, we don't know who's around us at what point and how they're being affected by the space, because it truly bleeds into everything.
Yeah. Why do you think, and I kind of know the answer, but I just want to speak to those that may be ignorant to it, but, like, where does that shame come from of, like, being in the foster care system?
Yeah.
Like, why would you, like, why would somebody, how does somebody end up in foster care?
Right.
Where does that kind of shame come from of, I don't want people to know that this is part of my life.
Sure. The lack of a family unit.
Yeah.
So, and like you said, you probably already knew the answer to that. But you take a kid who they're getting, I go pick up my son, a caseworker goes and picks up this kid. Sometimes these kids are in and out. They're 1 minute they're in school, they're the new kid. It usually takes anywhere between 6 to 7 placements before a kid actually finds a consistent placement for where they're going to be fostered. They jump around a lot. And so things can happen in their family where they go back home and then they're back in foster care again because mom and dad meet the requirements needed to be able to keep their child. So it just goes round and round and round, and their life is very transient. And so it's embarrassing for them when they see other kids who have this consistency and they don't have that. Even if they're in a foster family for a little bit and you think, oh, they're foster. Well, foster families usually disrupt after their first placement. It's hard. Maybe they didn't really realize what they were getting into. Right. They say usually 50% of foster families that disrupt say that they disrupted because of lack of support. So they end up saying, man, we just can't do this. We don't have the support that we need. They disrupt. Well, that kid goes back into the system again. So now they're in another placement, you know? And I think that's where it comes from.
Interesting. I was, this might get political fast, but that's okay.
Do it. You're good. I'll leave you to take care of all the edits.
Yeah, I'll cut everything out if we need to. But I remember I heard a message that Peter Reeves spoke. I don't know if you're connected with him at all.
No.
AG guy, he's awesome. And one of his neighbors was Muslim.
Okay.
And had tons of kids at their house all the time.
Gotcha.
And I think they were from Arab descent, and so it was always interesting. Pastor Peter would be like, "You got like white kids over at your house, you know. You got black kids at your house, you know. You got all these different ethnic groups of kids just showing up at your house all the time, and it's like constantly here." And he's like, "Oh yeah, we foster children on a monthly basis. You know, we keep them for the minimum.
Okay.
You know, and we teach them Islam."
Yeah.
And it like shook Peter so much that he was just like, that's how they're sharing their message.
Yeah.
Is they're fostering kids. The government is paying them to foster these kids.
Right.
And they're indoctrinating them with Islam.
Right.
And whether it sticks or not, you know, it's just their way of continuing to push their, message forward. And I think it's so interesting to me that they've sort of found this way to like keep kids coming in and using the system to try to push, Islam across the U.S.
Sure.
Are you seeing that at all here in Tennessee, or are you seeing like how these kids are? Because whenever I think of foster care, this is kind of the point I'm trying to make. When I think of foster care, I think of people using children and using the system to make money. Yeah. And I know that might feel like a hot button thing.
It's not. I mean, I would say being very candid, I think in and of itself, there is a lot of money that goes in and out of people's hands in this space. It's such a, like I said earlier, it's such a nuanced space. So when you look at foster care, you're looking at foster parents. You're looking at residential facilities. So these are locations in which are for-profit locations. They get paid per bed to be able to house a kid to help rehabilitate them. And then you look at group homes. Okay, those are, again, licensed facilities that are paid. And then you look at mental health. You go as far as prescriptions that these kids are on. I mean, they are medicated to the nine. Wow. And so you look at, the pharmaceutical aspect of just pumping them full of stuff. You look at the counseling that takes place and that's needed. And then you have your for-profit or your nonprofits that are in spaces as well too. And then you have your state workers. So there's all these areas where there's an exchange of a dollar. And at the end of the day, I absolutely believe that kids suffer because of, can suffer because of that. I think the state does the best that they can do to be able to help mitigate that. Sure. But when you have someone who is fostering for the wrong reasons or trying to foster as many kids as possible so that they can, or maybe fostering, for example, for every level that you foster, there's more money for that level on what the needs are for that child. So there's more money involved. So if you think of like, there's a young kiddo that has a lot of disabilities, and then how much it takes and time it takes to take care of them, it probably wouldn't be wise to have 4 or 5 kiddos that have those disabilities. But yet a lot of times people will do that, and they won't say it's because if they want money and maybe they really are able to do it. Some maybe are, and then maybe others are doing it for the wrong reasons. I think what I've seen is that the media loves to highlight planes that crash more than they like to highlight places that land.
No, it's good.
And so what I always try to tell people, because they ask that question a lot, have you seen where kids are being abused and they're in homes they shouldn't be? I was like, absolutely. But I will say that what you hear is predominantly planes that are crashing and not nearly enough planes that are landing.
Yeah.
And so, like, I just went to CAFO a couple of months ago. That's 4,000 people, 44 countries. Those are all planes landing all the time. You didn't hear any highlights of 4,000 people gathered in Tennessee and the governor sharing an address there.
Right.
And, the movie Sound of Hope with that pastor was there preaching up a storm on foster care.
Wow.
You don't hear any of that in the media, but like if there's one bad situation with our caseworker, you're going to hear that. And so there is that, but there's so much more good. And I would say really the big thing that you're going to see is you do see people recruiting for the wrong reasons to foster there. And I think the enemy, is always looking for a way to steal, kill, and destroy.
Yeah.
And if he can cause a child to repeat or inherit things generationally that will cause them death or cause them dysfunction or cause them fill in the blank, he's going to do that. And so you will have your LGBTQ plus community rise up, and they're going to be the ones who are trying to bring it. Well, that changes their identity of a family unit. Same thing with if we have different denominations or different faith communities that are pulling in religious groups. Thank you. That's a better word. That's going to change or could change it too. And so I think that's the importance of a gospel-centered church who's saying, hey, we're not okay with that. And again, not that everybody has to be a foster parent. I always believe that, and I want to push that. And I think kind of going back to education, that's what's missing. Is I hear from people a lot of times who say, oh man, I can't do that, I'm too old. Okay, well, not everybody is called to be a foster parent. I don't believe that. I believe that everybody is called to foster care, though. Everybody can do something.
Well, because you made the point too, like a lot of the disruptions, as you called them, when a kid, has to get separated from the foster parents, it's because they didn't have the support that they needed.
Sure, 100%.
And what can we as the church, how can we be that support? Like a pastor may not foster a kid.
Right.
But how can a pastor, how can the church support families that are fostering?
Yeah, no doubt. So I fully believe it has to come from the top down. Okay. There are so many great organizations out there. You have Tennessee Kids Belong. You have Every Child Tennessee, Promise 686. Like you have all the, Compact. You have all these organizations that do really great things. Backyard Orphans is one. They do great things, and they're a lot of times I think what can happen, and I've been in vocational ministry. I've worked right alongside my lead pastor of a large church in New York, and so I get it that it can seem like another thing.
Right.
And there are those things that are just another thing where it's like there's a book I love called Simple Church. Highly recommend if you haven't read it. It just talks about your strategy, your discipleship process for your church and knowing what to say no to. And Craig Rochelle is big on that all the time, saying no to everything, right? And so I understand that concept, but there are some things biblically that we're not allowed to say no to. And we have to accept that. So we're not going to say no to communion. We're not going to say no to baptism. We're not going to say no to having the thread of the gospel through our messages. And the Bible is very clear on what it means for embracing the orphan, embracing the fatherless. And I believe that the Bible's so clear on it is because that's exactly what God did for us. And so if we turn a blind eye to that, we're turning a blind eye to the entire gospel of what Jesus did for us at the work of the cross, which is just crazy because the whole story, like you look at Joseph and Mary, I mean, Joseph, if you want to say, was an adoptive parent. I mean, he stepped into this space and not knowing, the uncertain, not his child, yet raising it as his own. And he is the first, the adoptive parent. You look at Moses, he was adopted as well too. And so you look at this process that happens through Scripture, and then, I mean, the New Testament is full of this, verbiage of just adoption and, how we were enemies and now we're friends and all this verbiage around that. So to say that we aren't going to do it from the top down, I think we have to ask ourselves, well, why? I think we have a fear, again, education, I think can be a piece too. It can be a fear of like, well, I'm not fostering, so why would I want to tell my congregation to foster?
Right.
And in order to do that, like I want to lead by example, so I need to foster. It's like, no, you don't. We just are going to be aware that this is happening, and we're going to, from the top down, say, hey, we're just going to make sure that we preach. Like even I just say this alone, wouldn't it be amazing if 200 churches, I think there's the Assemblies of God churches in the state of Tennessee. Let's say 200 churches just committed to just preaching it. That's it. Just saying, hey, I'm going to share this message, and I'm going to allow there to be a space for just a conversation around what's happening at our state. Yeah. We're going to pray for them, and that's it. No application other than that. We're just going to get done. We're going to pray. That in and of itself would be huge,
right?
Because it's going to cause people to think, wow, there's 8,000 kids. Wow, this is something that God's called us to.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that the pastor has to be a foster parent.
Right.
It doesn't mean that he even has to know about foster care. It's just saying that, like, this is happening in our state, in our backyard, in our school. And so just by bringing awareness to it, I believe that once we even just do that alone, that there'll be things that the Holy Spirit does where all of a sudden someone will come up and say, man, that message impacted me in a way you never believe. I used to be in foster care. You're like, get out of here. Are you serious? Or you'll get the couple in the corner who say, we have been praying if we should or should not foster these children. And this message just confirmed that we are meant to do that.
Yeah.
And you will see it pop up.
Right.
And next thing you know, you might even get somebody who says, I have wanted so bad to lead a foster care ministry. Like, can we talk about that?
Yeah.
That it will take care of itself.
Yeah.
Like, you don't have to worry about a program. You don't have to worry about all that. I mean, there's so much out there, which I'm happy to have conversations with people about how to help, minimize the number of clicks and make it easy. And so you can just, have something simple, but at the same time, just preaching it alone is going to cause a huge difference just within that church.
It's so practical too, because I feel like a lot of preachers across, the U.S. and across Tennessee, we talk about, this kind of wave of, we even kind of mentioned it before, of cultural, identity politics and all this sort of stuff kind of attacking the church.
Yeah.
And so we stand up in our pulpits and we say, like, oh, the LGBT, whatever, we stand firm and blah, blah, blah. It's like, we can stand firm all we want,
right,
but what are we actually doing to help, like, craft and shape the identity of this generation coming up?
Yes.
And I think that, like, foster care to me just feels like one of those practical things where it's like, here is a group of young people who are struggling with their identity.
Yes.
Because they've grown up without, the family unit, like you're talking about.
For sure.
And they don't really have a choice of who fosters them.
No.
And it could, like you said, it could be an LGBTQ couple.
Yeah.
It could be a Muslim, family.
Yeah.
It could be just somebody who is far from God, and like you said, the plane crashing versus it landing.
Sure.
But man, if we can be the ones to step in, we have the ability to shape the identity of these kids and in the future.
Yes. And again, you're so right. Like, and doing it from the top down, it's that ownership of saying, and we need that in everything in leadership, like in culture and values. Like, if it's not top down, it eventually starts to dissolve and it's not there anymore.
Yeah.
But when someone owns it at the top and they consistently, again, just even if it was just that once a year on Orphan Sunday, or hey, this once a year we're going to shed light onto this, or mix it up and have a different speaker come in or whatever, you'll start to see that the Lord will just pop up things that are happening in people's hearts in this space, and it's really beautiful when you see that.
Yeah,
it really is.
There was so I went and preached at a church. I'll tell you off camera where it was here in Tennessee.
Okay.
But like,
I'm excited.
It was so wild because I showed up again. This is when we were missionaries. We were traveling, preaching, trying to raise money, all the things. And I'm there on a Wednesday night, and half of the church congregation were kids, and some of them had special needs. Some of them, they were just a little buck wild or whatever. Sure, and so it was funny because they kept turning my mic up in order so I could be louder than all the kids that were screwing around. Yeah, it was just it was wild. Awesome. It was so cool though.
Yeah.
And the pastor and his wife had like a hopefully if you're watching, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember they had something like 6 or 7 kids that they were fostering. And this was an older couple.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to them about it afterwards, like, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
And they're just like, we know their parents. And their parents are strung out on drugs.
Yeah.
And if we didn't take these kids in, the system would have got them.
Yep.
And it was like this beautiful, like, for me, I was just like in shock that they were doing this, but
that's incredibly hospitable.
But it was like, we're gonna do this, and we're gonna pray and believe for their parents to see things shift. And they were making comments too, like, there's other families in our church who have gotten onto this and have adopted some of these kids, and
I love that.
it's just this really cool thing. And it cracked me up though, because again, half the church for these kids was like, hey, this is a great way to grow your church.
Yeah.
just start fostering and adopting kids.
I don't know anybody, honestly. No one have I ever met really that said, oh, we just prayed and decided we wanted to foster and then fostered. Very small percentage.
Yeah.
I would say the majority of the people that I've met, it fell on their lap.
Yeah.
Like,
or they saw somebody else doing it.
Or they saw someone else doing
Yeah.
it, and they began to have conversations, and again, it kind of fell on their lap. Or it was somebody in their church, and all of a sudden they're like, wait, what's going on with this family? And then that family can then be what they call a kinship placement, because they know that family in their church, so they don't have to go through a home study, and so that kid can stay with them temporarily until mom and dad can figure it out. I mean, I saw my mom and dad do this. I mean, my wife and I, that's one of the biggest reasons how we got into it. It wasn't like necessarily like, hey, we want to be involved in foster care and we believe in it. We were very young, so for us it was more, we just kept serving a very vulnerable population of people.
Yeah.
And next thing you know, we became in contact with their teachers and their caseworkers, and then the caseworkers were calling me as a pastor and saying, hey, we need families, because otherwise they're going to go into the system. And so then it just became like, I'm just asking people in our church, hey, would you take these kids in?
Yeah.
Because they're going to go into the system. And then so they were like knighted IW, kinship family, foster family, and next thing you know, those kids are in their house.
Wow.
So it like expedited super fast, because they're always looking for a kinship placement first. But it just shows you how fast it can happen when you're just put your yes on the table.
Wow.
And you're willing. And I saw the beauty of that even in our own story in fostering. My wife and I had many, many kids in and out of our house, and I'll never forget one specifically where we have this young girl who came in, and she had a large sibling set, tons of kids, and she came into our home very young, and she was scared, just terrified. Mom and dad were going to our church, and dad was incarcerated. Mom was going through a real hard time, and we really wrapped around the entire family. We had her for over a year, and I never forget taking notes back and forth from her to her dad in prison.
Wow.
And seeing her dad come to know Jesus in prison.
Wow.
And just that relationship, and then her dad finally getting out and her being able to actually go back home. And I'll never forget her dad being like, I don't know that I would have known Jesus if it wasn't for me watching you love me and love my daughter and my family. And I don't say that because of like, oh, good job, John, but it just shows you the power of this space. Like, there's so much ministry in it. And I'm not going to, it's hard.
Yeah.
Like, super hard.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, our son was going through cancer at the time. He was 2. My wife's a full-time nurse.
Yeah.
I'm full-time ministry. We have a foster child as well, too.
Yeah.
I mean, it was not a simple journey by any means, but I think it's just putting your yes onto the table and saying, Lord, do we really believe that the things that he gives us is for his use? Or do we kind of live that lifestyle of saying, hey, I don't want to be interrupted. I don't want to be disturbed in my Christianity. I want to play it safe. I want to come in. I want to leave.
Yeah.
I don't want to get too deep in community, because then there's problems. And even though I'm asking you like, hey, how are you? I really don't want to know, because that means I have to now engage.
Right.
So we do this, whether we admit it or not.
Right.
And it creates kind of like a simple faith. And I just believe like God wants us to live much more radical than that.
Yeah.
And it's hard, but it also, that I love that song that just came out, Yahweh, we love you, through Elevation Church.
Yeah.
And in that second verse, he says, he takes the orphan and doubles their portion.
Wow.
And I truly believe that with anything in our life, when we step into the place of difficulty to be able to do ministry, that's when we see miracles happen. And the Lord not only doubles the orphan's portion, but he doubles ours too, because we're stepping into a place where we need a double portion.
Yeah.
We love to pray all the time. God, give me a double portion. God, give me this. But it's like, you don't need it because you're not stepping anywhere where you would need it. You got to step into it where you're desperate for it, and then I'll meet you there, right?
Dude, I've preached this before, and I'll say it now. Some people pray for the Holy Spirit when they're not living a life that needs it.
Right.
Like, the Holy Spirit gives you like the power to evangelize. It gives you the power to take on, orphans and take on like foster kids and all these different things. And like so many people, we're living in that comfortable church life. Yeah. And they pray for the Holy Spirit, but once he starts to move and once he starts to say, like, push you, shake things up, it's like, whoa. I didn't ask for this.
For sure.
But seriously though, I think it's such a practical and powerful thing that we can do that creates depth in our faith. Yeah. Because I think that for a lot of believers that they grew up in Christian homes, a lot of pastors who've had Christian life and home and all these things, they don't understand this group of people. And because they've never actually tried to address that problem. We can so often compartmentalize our Christian faith, like you're talking about, but we do it in the church too. And we want peace. Yeah. But war is raging all around us. Yeah. And the fight for the identity of all these kids is happening all around us with culture. This is such a amazing way that we can start to change culture. Yes. Huge. Like just even if it's just for one kid, you're making a huge difference.
Oh, absolutely. And when you look at the kids, I mean, we see like Simone Biles, who, I mean, foster child. Yeah. You think of, even the great Babe Ruth. I mean, he was inspired by people that were coming along his life and mentoring him when he had nobody. I mean, there's just so many stories of people that are in this space and that people wrapped around, and that God did great things to their life, or maybe God didn't do anything in their life, but they just had people who loved them and cared for them, and they just still had success because they just had a loving adult. And I say that all the time, like, every child is one success story away from a caring adult. Yeah. And it's so true. And I think it can feel very complex again, because it's like, there's all this stuff that you can do, and it can be overwhelming. Sure. Like, I don't know if we've all gone to those conferences, and there can be so much practical content where you leave and you're just like, oh God,
where do I start?
Like, where do I start here? Like, I feel more discouraged than I do before I came. Yeah. And I think that's why we're just, as a network, really trying to just make it very simple and saying, hey, you don't have to know anything. And that's okay to say you don't know. It's actually a really good thing to say, hey, I don't know, I need to be taught. Right. I need to be taught by maybe there's a foster family in our church I can take out to coffee, and I can say, hey, I don't know about this space. Yeah. Like, can you tell me about your journey? Like, just teach me. Yeah. And I think, again, as a network, just keeping it very simple, saying like, hey, we have 3 on-ramps, saying, hey, we want every church to preach. We want every church to identify. Who's your DCS office? Yeah. Do you know them? Do they know you? Are there foster families in your church that you just had no idea were fostering? Is there someone that was a foster child in your church that you just didn't even know that they were even an adoptive child or foster child? Is there a caseworker in your church that you didn't even know they were a caseworker? Yeah. But they're there. And so you're identifying these things, and then you're just, as a church, saying, how can we serve them? Yeah. And that's customizable to each church. I think there's a lot of times, again, it can be very practical and overwhelming because you have a lot of different organizations who come in and say, well, every church should do this. Yeah. And there's trainings, and there's this, you need a point person, you need a coach, and that it can be like, wow, that's a lot for us, or we just don't have the ability to do that. Yeah. So then they don't do anything. Yeah. And really, I think it's really more of a customizable approach of saying, well, what works for every church? Because you might have very rural church of 20, 30 people that are over the age of 65. Yeah. But there's a local DCS office. What if they made meals? Yeah. And dropped them off? Because there's kids probably sleeping in that office. Yeah. What if they made meals for those kids? Right. What if they dropped off goodie bags and just said, hey, we love you, we're thinking about you, to the caseworkers, just to encourage them. Those are simple things that can be done that help with retention. And caseworkers, foster families, and those type of leaders. So
I love it. It's funny too, and I feel like we keep driving this point home. But
yeah, do it, man.
We so often we want separation of church and state.
Yeah.
And we even talk about that from the platform sometimes, where it's like we don't want the state telling the church what to do.
Right.
But then we as a church have no problem criticizing our government.
Oh, for sure.
Or the systems, or all the the system's broken, all the things. Well, like, what are we doing to fix it?
Yeah.
What are we doing to, come in and bridge that gap? And because when you look at it from this angle, there are kids in the gap.
Yeah.
There are children in the gap that, man, if we don't step in, the system is going to eat them up, or someone else is going to step in that's not going to shape them in the right way.
Yeah.
And I think, again, this is just such a powerful, practical way that we as a church can shape the future.
Yes. I heard a caseworker, we were in the talking, and I said to her, what involvement do you have with the church? And she wasn't really like I don't think she's a follower of Jesus, but she basically said, I stopped knocking. I stopped asking the church for help because it just became much more of a issue of just constantly trying to share a cry for help.
Yeah.
And no one responding. They just stopped knocking. And I think to myself, dude, that is so sad that someone that isn't really following Jesus but recognizes that this is a faith-based organization that in their mind would be caring and be willing to help, and they knock on the door and they're trying to get a hold of a lead pastor or trying to connect. This is a state trying to connect with the church.
Yeah.
And they turn a blind eye.
Wow.
And she said, I stopped knocking. And I just thought to myself, I encouraged her, because here's the thing I'm very, very adamant about is I think a lot of times people love to poo-poo on the church.
Sure.
Right? And they just kind of, the church this, the church that, and we hear that all the time, I'm sure, as pastors, where people are church hopping and they know they don't get it and they need to do this. I'm an absolute huge fan of the church.
Yeah.
I believe in it 100%. Through our organization, I tell people all the time that yes, the Bridge House is a faith-based organization, and yes, we serve all of Middle Tennessee with what we do, but we are only as good as the partnerships that we have with our church, because we can provide housing, we can provide support, we can provide wraparound care, but at the end of the day, those kiddos, those families need to be in a church community where they're discipled and they're shepherded and they're cared for, they're pastored. And so we're always bridging. And that's one of the reasons why we do those foster family night outs too. It's because we do them at a different church every quarter.
That's cool.
And we tell the pastor, we are bringing 50 families to your church that don't attend your church. And it is your job to figure out how you want to engage them so that they'll come back on Sunday. Yeah. And they're like, oh my gosh, thank you. So, and that's because we believe in the local church. Yeah. And so I think when I say that, I want to make sure that with everything I'm saying, that I don't feel like the church just didn't get it and I do.
No, I got you.
I just see the power that they have and the force that pastor has to be able to rally their congregation into any direction that he really believes the Lord calling them to is a very supernatural power. And there's nobody that I know of that has the ability to do that. And when you think of over 11,000 churches in Tennessee who are doing that every Sunday, what are we leading those congregations to? And I just feel like we have to have this foster care conversation a part of it. Otherwise, we're just basically allowing the enemy to take a generation of kids and just allow them to continue just in these generational curses of sickness and abuse and neglect and substance abuse and sexual immorality and sexual identity issues. And we're just saying, oh man, well, what's wrong with our society? Even if you go to like the local jail, like if any pastor go to your local jail, ask the sheriff and say, what are the ages of the kids that are in your local jail right now? Right. He will tell you they're between the ages of 18 to 22, 23. And if you look at the population, the demographic of how many of those kids have been in foster care, I guarantee it'll be at least half, if not more.
Wow.
because they aged out, they didn't have the support, and even through prior years, they were jumping around in transition. They never had the caring adult.
Yeah.
And so as soon as they got out, they went right back into to doing what they only know how to do. They hustle. That's all they know how to do is hustle.
Right.
And they're good at it. And they got caught, and now they're in jail.
Wow.
Right?
Wow. It even go back to what we were hitting before. Like, there was a statement made that really shook not just my dad and I here at Full Life, but shook our whole church. If we closed our doors tomorrow, would it affect our community?
Yeah, that's good.
And it really pushed us to make those connections with local government.
Yes.
And make connections with people, not just the people that come through the doors of our church,
Yes.
but like really helping us like get out there and get focused. Because again, there, like you said earlier, there's people that are knocking.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't hear them knocking, or we ignore them, or whatever it might be.
Sure.
But man, if we would begin to make that effort, the church becomes the center of the community of
Yes.
I know the church is a place that I can depend on, and families come together, and that's where they gain that support. And I would hate for any of our Assemblies of God churches to close their doors and people be like, oh, that church closed. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I feel like getting involved with, these governmental systems that we know are broken, or we say are broken,
Yeah.
and coming alongside them and saying, what can we do?
Yes.
How can we support you? How can we, can we do these events like you're talking about, like where it's, once a month we host this. I love what you're saying about, some older congregations, like we'll make food, we'll make meals. We've done that too. There's a foster group home for boys down south from here.
Awesome.
And we bring, because we started doing monthly feeding programs at our church. And so all of the extra food we take down there.
Yes.
And it's enough food to last them for over a month or two sometimes.
And it's simple. That's one thing I love about it. Like what you just said, that's a simple thing.
Yeah.
And I think as God a lot of times we'll bring our leadership, our pastoral teams, our lead pastors, and they have a ton of vision. And I love that. And I'm a visionary too. I know I can tell you're a huge visionary as well. And with that, we think of the big things that we got to do.
Right.
But the big can also be overwhelming.
Right.
Because when we think, oh, well, if we're big, well, then we have to create systems.
Yeah, you talk yourself out of doing it.
And then you think, oh, well, never mind. I don't want to do all that.
Right.
And so there's a book I'm reading, which is not a new book, but it's called Atomic Habits by James Clear.
Yeah,
Great book.
Great book.
And it's that 1%, that managing the 1% every single day yields to that huge result over time.
That's right.
And so I think of just the 1% with what you just talked about. Like this is just, hey, we have extra food. We're going to go down to the local group home for boys. We're going to say what's up. We might say, give a couple high fives with the kids, drop off some food. And we're going to do that consistently.
Yeah.
And then, well, guess what? Now you've developed a relationship with, their executive director, whoever their leader is over there. And now when they have a need, they might say, well, hey, this is the church that drops off food all the time. Or, hey, we have a kiddo who wants to go to church. Well, let's take them over, to this church because they've just been regularly showing up. And then God starts to work through that.
Yeah.
But it's that little 1%. And we don't know who that one boy may be that may come here.
Right.
I believe, we use that verbiage, and one of the things I try to do even with our own organization at the Bridge House is try not to use too many words that talk about, vulnerable children or at-risk kids, but instead of almost speaking prophetically over them.
Right.
And so we always use these words like future leaders,
Come on.
Future pastors, future businessmen and businesswomen that God is going to use. And so we don't know that future leader what God is putting in his heart to do.
Yeah.
That may absolutely be something that shakes the world in a massive way because of one church who brought over food.
we pray into their potential.
That's right.
I love it. Cool. Dude, this has been great. Give me just one final point, because I know you mentioned it already, but it can be overwhelming, all the resources
for sure.
and all the stuff that we can get into.
I get overwhelmed by it.
But what are some next steps that we can take? I know we're preaching, we're identifying, but what are some next steps that we can take in the foster care journey as a church? Just even speak to camera, speak to our pastors.
Sure. Honestly, I would feel privileged. This is such a huge passion of mine an absolute privilege where if I know for me in this space, I've had to ask so many questions throughout my journey through it. Even as a CEO and founder of what we do, I'm always learning. I'm always pulling in on caseworkers and trying to figure out like, what is it that God's calling us to do and how are we going to do it, and learning this space. Yes, our on-ramps are preach, identify, and serve. But I will say one of the things that I'm super passionate about is just having a conversation with a lead pastor or with, maybe if they do have a very high capacity staff member or volunteer who can champion this forward with them, and having a conversations to what would it look like to customize this around your church. And really it's just me basically coming alongside them to answer questions so that it can be easy, can minimize the number of clicks. It doesn't seem overwhelming, and it can be sustainable. Because that's the biggest thing, is what can we do that's consistent, that's sustainable, and minimizing those number of clicks so that we can look back 2-3 years from now, we still got something cooking. That's creating change over time.
I love it. Well, connect with Pastor John. Would love to see that happen. Go to Tennessee Ministry Network, or I'm sorry, go to TNMN.org or TNOG.org and click on foster care. And you'll get more information there, and your contacts and all that stuff. But,
dude, just fill it out, hit me, and I'll give you a call.
Thanks for doing this. Thanks for
thank you.
out.
It was fun.
It was awesome.